Was the Switch 2 ever actually delayed? It is a question that obsessed Nintendo YouTube for a year, and yet once a new system releases, it's funny how the petty dramas and obsessions in the build up to the machine disappear into the rearview mirror and suddenly seem rather unimportant. I remember quite respectable people talking about how terribly the December and January Switch 2 leaks would be for the company, and thinking, well, will they? And certainly from the vantage point of after the Switch 2 launch, it's difficult to even remember the specifics of leaks that are still relatively recent. But of course, for anyone who follows the ins and outs of Nintendo obsessively, it's impossible not to be buffeted by the tides of rumour. One persistent rumour was the imminent release of Switch 2, alongside the new Zelda, perhaps after the next holiday season, just after, any day now. And like Charlie Brown on the football, every time it seemed about to drop, something would be taken away. Perhaps the most concrete sounding rumour was that in early 2024, Nintendo delayed the Switch 2 console. They looked at the system sitting proudly on the shelf and went, nah, not yet. The variants of this rumour include assertions that it was the games that were a problem and Nintendo wanted a dense lineup of content to avoid the kind of content droughts that afflicted the early 3DS, Wii U, and indeed the second year of the Nintendo Switch itself. Now, until or unless we get a tell-all interview from Nintendo about the past, which likely won't be for decades if ever, it's unlikely that we will ever know for sure. Maybe this was always Nintendo's plan. Maybe there was an internal delay. But I thought it would be interesting to at least consider to what extent this rumour might have been true. Fair warning, I have no rabbit out of the hat or extraordinary evidence to provide, but I think it's going to be fun to explore the context of this situation anyway, to see where Nintendo might have been standing. First of all, let's remember that the audience is not coming from a neutral vantage point. Audience members are always excited for new things, and while I was actually very happy with my Switch OLED, I also was dying to see what new hardware could bring, and especially to see a new generation of those major games, including the return of many old favourites. I notice a trend with public predictions from many people, which I've previously encapsulated as, I guess, the Nintendo forecast rule of Nintendo. For very big things, you will wait the longest you could possibly expect to wait, and then a little bit more. So I remember in about 2020 or 2021 doing a message board poll of when you expect the Breath of the Wild sequel to be coming out, and I chose the option of January to March 2023. I was very much in the minority, being that apparently pessimistic, but I don't know if there even was a later option, or if it was just after the 2023 financial year. But Tears of the Kingdom took until May 2023 to release. Now sure, pandemic, long time testing, etc, etc. I'm not saying there weren't good reasons for the game to be held back, but good reasons or not, consumers were consistently overconfident in their expectations of when the next Zelda would drop. With Switch 2, I have receipts on myself expecting that the end of the 2024 to 25 financial year was kind of the outer tramline for the central expectation. Now, after this, though earlier than most, I pivoted to seriously considering later in 2025 as a possibility. But I remember multiple YouTubers going back not all that long talking about how ridiculous the concept was that the Switch could go even 8 years. Like, a wait till March 2025 for a new system would be madness, because there's no way the console wouldn't fall in on itself like a dying star if left so long. 2022, 2023 was the general consensus at first, and then the grudging possibility emerged that 2024 would have to be the time the new system would drop, surely. By the way, similar patterns emerged on price, and I think I can say that my videos on price expectations hold up very well, but I don't think the expectations of a $450 system were all that high on people's radars until in the few months or so before, when the PlayStation 5 Pro had a crazy price point and people became aware that a higher price point could be a thing. All this is something I'm very conscious of when discussing 3D Mario and Super Smash Bros. For Switch 2. Our expectation is that the games will come sooner rather than later. There's a financial logic to them coming sooner than later, but if you disaggregate the hopium, Nintendo will actually be perfectly fine as long as they play their other cards right if they need to hold these franchises back longer. Not saying they want to, certainly not saying it's plan A, just that it's easy to be biased by hope. And so, for Nintendo in 2025, when everything is being framed in the media around a new console being just around the corner, the obvious spin is that this is a delay, that they have delayed their new console, and so we are going to have to wait all that much longer. But was this ever true? I mean, consider the position from Nintendo and also from their media contacts. It was never a secret that Nintendo were working on some kind of new technology because they've always said that they are constantly working on new tech. And Shuntaro Furukawa had made comments about where we were in the lifespan in the Switch and such like. Expectations being what they were, though, they would have wanted to seed the idea that no, a console isn't going to be coming in this coming financial year. This has a few purposes. Firstly, it communicates to their shareholders in all candor, and we know from their 2024 corporate governance report that they did discuss the possibility and prognosis of new consoles at that time, with various people showing an interest. I suspect this build-up of pressure also prompted them to finally issue the scant information that they did in May 2024, that more information will be forthcoming. After all, they legally need to ensure that their shareholders are kept up to date. The second purpose was very evidently to stop their June 2024 reveals, their massive games for the Switch holiday season, being eclipsed by constant discussion about the new console. Ironically, Super Mario Party Jamboree at least turned out to be very pertinent indeed to Switch 2, and of course the June 2024 Direct was broadly welcomed and celebrated in the end for being fairly dense with great game announcements, but this was a factor of careful expectations management as well as, frankly, not revealing an awful lot for a time beforehand, so they had a lot stocked up to reveal. Now, this is a difficult juggling act for Nintendo. You would think logically that they should always be releasing new games. People can't buy games that haven't been released after all, and Nintendo likes people buying their games. They also want to ensure that the large Switch install base continues playing, and most people seem to have done so, with their recent report suggesting only a negligible drop-off in Switches being used in a calendar year, although to be fair, that statistic only tracks people who logged in at least once. I suspect the intensity of play was indeed down a fair bit. However, here's the thing. Releasing too many new games wouldn't necessarily have moved the dial. It's rare for late in-life titles to outperform earlier installments in a series. Even a huge title like Super Mario Bros. Wonder is still, for now at least, trailing new Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe in terms of sales. A birdo in the hand is worth much more on Switch 2, and so releasing games isn't necessarily plan A if they can save them for a more successful outing on the sequel system. But more than that, the Switch was full of games already. Almost nobody, however big a Nintendo fan, could have every first-party title. Now, it's true that the impact of sales on any individual title from sweating the back catalogue would only be very minor numbers of people picking them up, with the exception, of course, of those massive evergreens like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. But this would be multiplied across a huge number of people. So sure, a modestly successful new game could pick up 2 million in sales. Alternatively, promoting 40 existing titles, well, those could each put on an average of 50,000 copies. Now, this wouldn't be reported by Nintendo, the numbers are too low individually, but in the aggregate, it would be the same value as producing a new game, and of course better for Nintendo because they kept the game that they would have developed for another day to sell again. The risk for Nintendo in this late phase is that anything new they put out potentially cannibalizes sales and attention from their other series, and the thing is, those purchases of old titles could become even more critical in the future over the long term. So, to illustrate this, let's say someone decides to try something that they would not ordinarily have tried, a different game series. Suddenly, you have a potential new, lifelong fan of Luigi's Mansion or Paper Mario or, dare I say, Advance Wars. New nostalgia being created and a new fan base for these games for potentially years to come. While on the outside it looks like Nintendo may be being inactive, and the assumption would be that they must be panicking and about to drop some big news to fill the vacuum, silence has a power in itself, and it's a power I think Nintendo is happy to exercise. 19th century statesmen used to boast about policies of masterly inactivity. Basically, sometimes it's not worth tinkering with things because you can make things worse, not better. I really see 2024 as Nintendo taking this precept to heart. All of which makes me feel that it's quite possible that there was never any real intention of a 2024 release for Switch 2, but that for a variety of reasons, this was interpreted as a delay by the press. On the other hand, I can also see why a console would have been expected earlier internally. After all, Nintendo's top brass monitor their numbers closely. If the sales and interest in the console suddenly went off a cliff, they would want to have the capability to act quickly and decisively. While I personally didn't feel Switch had too much to worry about from a long final act, it's true that the Wii especially is an example of a system whose sales tanked and whose profile was incredibly low for 2 years before the Wii U launched. Still, it's a matter of how all this is done. It feels to me more plausible for Nintendo to strategize with short, medium, and long-term approaches, but not necessarily to pencil in specifics until closer to the time. It seems likely to me that at the end of the 2023 to 2024 financial year, they had to sit down and really judge the pressures they were under and what strategy they would undertake. There were definitely currency reasons, as I mentioned at the time, for Nintendo to hold their fire, and one underrated reason for Nintendo's significant extra profitability post-pandemic isn't just the Switch sales, but also the historically very kind exchange rate from Nintendo's perspective. Also, they must have considered the potential for their new games to have more development time at the same time as thinking that there were assets still to be pushed on the existing Switch, which could still net them a healthy profit. If you think that Nintendo wouldn't push developers and seem to allow endless delays on their titles, well, that may seem to be true, but multiple people, including our Noma himself, have commented that there is pressure to get new games out. But of course, Nintendo also understands the unique pressures their games developers are under, so I'm sure etiquette, if nothing else, would prevent Furukawa applying undue pressure on the game developers to rush games to market. They have done this in the past. Wind Waker was reportedly slightly rushed towards the end, and it's not always worked out well for them. The delay narrative assumes that holiday 2024 was ever a strong possibility, and I can completely believe that it was, but only as part of a set of competing contingencies. If you're going to launch a big system, holiday does make perfect sense as a time, but Nintendo have long experience of ducking this window. Not just the Switch, but the 3DS and even systems like the N64 and Game Boy back in the day launched outside November. They clearly did need some advance time to stockpile what appears to be in the ballpark of 5 million units to make the launch month go, if not smoothly, then at least less bumpily than past console launches, and launching during November would only have frustrated this, and this in itself I think would justify pushing the proposed release date from March to June, if you consider that 3 months is about the kind of time that you'd expect to be able to build up such a large backlog of consoles. I'm not sure, therefore, all things considered, that late 2024 was ever going to be a prime spot for them to release. Then again, Nintendo left the door open to the potential of the system coming during that financial year for a very long time indeed. So even then, I think they recognised that a degree of flexibility was needed, although to be fair, being that opaque also helped make sure that their current announcements were carefully scrutinised and not just written off. The closest likely trigger to the rumours may well have been that a progress report came in from a major game and the judgment was, it's not ready yet. Reports of Donkey Kong Bonanza looking a bit rough around the edges, even at launch events for Switch 2, make it seem unlikely that the game was sat on a shelf for months or years, although, of course, it's equally plausible that the final touch-ups were left while the team focused on other things, and it's now only in the last couple of months that they are tidying up the game ready for mass release. I believe that Nintendo had Mario Kart World in place for a good while, given that the game was developed originally for Switch 1, but without a major second game like Donkey Kong Bonanza has become, well, I love Metroid Prime 4, but I don't know I bet everything on it being the biggest system-selling title. To what degree this was a case of better keep a hold of Nurse for fear of finding something worse, it's hard to disentangle. Maybe Nintendo was simply afraid of launching new hardware, but I think this seems like a deliberate strategy, and I do think the need to have some major games alongside the Switch 2 probably played into their decisions. I guess personally I'm skeptical that there ever was, in quite the terms it was presented, a formal delay. I think Nintendo stuck their thumbs into the mid-distance and went, nah, we can still milk the Switch for a bit, these games will benefit from extra time in the oven, the world's a bit tasty, let's just not do this year. That's perfectly sensible and indeed what should happen for a company that is making a major and hugely consequential business decision. But it doesn't convey to me a massive change in plans, but rather a constant state of re-evaluation. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Do check out the Patreon if you have an interest in more, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.